Thank you. Thank you so much, AFA family, for having me here and to discuss a very important question that concerns law, culture, politics, and also our Christian faith. Are we a Christian nation? And if the answer is yes, how do we defend that to a very non-Christian culture? I would submit that we are a Christian nation. And the proof of that is in our founding documents and in the U.S. Constitution itself, because our founders recognized for the first time in world history that our rights come from God, our Creator, not our government. And the sole purpose of government is to preserve and protect those rights. Now, that has been true across world history. But our founders recognized that it wasn't just a bunch of people like here in this room that get to sit around and determine in deliberative bodies what defines rights. God himself defines who we are as human beings made in his image, and therefore he defines our rights. So the first thing that we have to do in order to discover our rights are to discover who our lawgiver and our right giver is. Who is the person of God? And our founders answered that question when they called him the Creator in the Declaration of Independence. That set forth the mandate in this country to require our government and obligate our government to primarily operate to preserve and protect our rights. So we can't even have a conversation about what is a civil right. Is that religious freedom? Is it freedom of speech? Is it human rights, like what the leftists would tell you, that the transgender person has a right to public accommodation and to compel a cake baker or a pastor to participate in a same-sex wedding ceremony, or a doctor to participate in a transgender surgery? When we define our rights, we have to first define who gives us our rights. He is the one who defines rights, and then we can have a conversation about how do we preserve and protect our rights. So we have to go back first and answer the question, what is the law? Because when we have this conversation about our rights and whether or not we are a Christian nation, often the immediate objection is, well, I'm not a Christian, and how dare you force your religion on me? And so the left would ask us to enter into a secular humanist playing field and suggest that we are the arbiters of our own reality, and whatever beliefs we internalize, that's the only basis upon which we can ask and answer and debate these questions. So law then, according to them, is inherently amoral, meaning that it's not moral or immoral. There's no actual measurable difference between right and wrong and good and evil. It's just whatever the current sovereign or government system sets and suggests. So that's how we get to, for example, in 1973, when Roe versus Wade, with a deliberative body of the Supreme Court, said that abortion was a constitutionally protected right for women to choose arbitrarily, capriciously, to kill their unborn child. But then with the Dobbs decision last year, suggesting then, well, no, that isn't a constitutionally protected right by that majority of the Supreme Court. So does morality shift and change depending on who the sovereign in control of the government is, or the composition of the members on the Supreme Court, or the occupant of the White House, or the people in Congress, or in state legislatures, governors? We saw through the COVID pandemic how so much of the moral questions of whether it was, quote unquote, good for the community and the society for the government to forcibly compel individuals to accept an experimental vaccine injection was good, according to some governors, and it was unconstitutional according to others. So this standard, as we're seeing in our current society, even just over the last 20, 30, 50 years, has shifted with the winds of cultural influences. That can't be a standard of law that is practical. And that was actually what was argued in the Supreme Court case in Dobbs, to say, what is a workable standard for abortion regulation? Well, what does that even mean? Shouldn't we first ask and answer the question, what can we do under our system of law? What does the Constitution genuinely say and control as our supreme law of the land here in America? What powers does it actually give to our federal branches of government? And under federalism, which is the separation of powers not just on the top federal executive level, but then between the federal government, the state government, the local government, and we the people who retain powers. What are those powers? And so when we ask and answer that question first, we have to go back to the Declaration of Independence as our founding document that recognized that rights are pre-political. They pre-exist any government system. So regardless of what an American system of government or any other world power or any national sovereignty and their system of government would define, God himself has defined our rights as pre-existing any system of government. Because every human being at the moment of conception has all of their rights that are God-given. They are unalienable. And when Thomas Jefferson put that phrase into the Declaration of Independence to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by God, their creator, with certain unalienable rights. What does that mean? Well, it was a property law term. He was very concerned about personal possession of property. Coming from the British common law system, if any of you have seen Downton Abbey and the whole controversy over who would inherit the estate and the fee-tail system of property inheritance under the British system, that's what America didn't want. We wanted to be able to freely alienate property and goods from ourselves. We wanted that free exchange under a genuine capitalist system of economy. And Thomas Jefferson was a huge advocate of that. So when he termed our rights as unalienable, that means the exact opposite. They cannot be alienated from us. They can't be bought, sold, abridged, infringed by anyone, including ourselves. I can't separate my own humanity from myself because it is God-given. That is the essential truth that our founders recognized. They didn't arbitrarily decide and determine we're going to believe this. They said this is self-evident truth. Like we could walk outside and self-evidently look at nature around us and say the sun rises and the sun sets, and that is a day. We can have an understanding of the world without our own opinions or our beliefs contriving that understanding. We discover how the world works around us. We didn't get together, for example, in a deliberative body in Congress and decide, you know what would be really great for America is to institute the law of gravity, right? That exists. It's part of nature, whether we like it or not. And if Congress today decided, I have a great idea, let's repeal the law of gravity. We all want to fly. We all want to be Superman, right? We would laugh, and rightly so, because we understand that there are limits to the power of government. We are bound by the laws of nature and of nature's God. To the empirical world that God has given us, this reality, we discover it. We learn how it works. Now, we are able to fly on airplanes in spite of the law of gravity, but it's not because we repealed it or we have any authority over it. It's because we understand and discover the principles of how it works in nature, and we negotiate with that. And at times we can manipulate it, right? And that's what we do in our system of limited powers in government. So what is the law when it comes to our system of civil society? And that's what politics is, or the body politic, is understanding truth in society. Because when we look at truth in the universe and the laws of nature, we are discovering something that is already there. When we look at science, We are discovering what is already there. And it's the same thing for politics. We are discovering the truth of what is already there in a good, just, moral, and upright society. Like Micah 6:8 says, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Discovering good and the measurable difference between right and wrong and good and evil is inherently part of the law of nature. And the Bible tells us that God writes his law on our hearts. We all know that there is a difference between right and wrong and good and evil. And so civil society is obligated in any system of government to promote good, what is permissive in society, and to restrain evil, what's prohibited in society. So who determines what's promoted and what's prohibited, what is allowed in society and what is criminalized? Well, if it's just the arbitrary whim of man's deliberative bodies, then the law is itself completely arbitrary, and we have to find these so-called workable standards. And the law then becomes fluid, and whatever culture says is right, politics is then downstream from culture. As Andrew Breitbart very famously said, politics is downstream from culture. But I would add on to that and say that in a moral, just, and upright society, a truthful society, culture is downstream from the biblical worldview. The biblical worldview and the person of truth must inform culture. We have to discover the truth about a moral and upright society. So the law itself is jurisprudence, or the study of the origins of law. And there are two main theories of law's origins: natural law, as we've talked about, or what the left would call legal positivism, or the social contract theory. And this is the lie that the left and the progressives would ask us to buy into, that in order to live in a well-ordered society, we have to all get together and participate in a contract and say, yes, we ordain these specific tenets of government like our US Constitution, but that's up to us whether we want to continue to live under that particular type of contract or whether we want to change it into something else. And that's what we're seeing today from the left. They want to change our institutions. They want to change the laws of morality. I'm starting to call this moral gerrymandering, where they take the bright lines of truth and they're trying to redistrict sin. And they're trying to say we are drawing different boundaries instead of understanding that the laws of nature and of nature's God are fixed. We have no power as human beings to manipulate those. We can only discover them and determine, are we going to live by truth and understand gravity exists? Or are we going to go up to a skyrise and say, I don't believe in gravity. I'm defined by my truth. I don't care what they say. Gravity doesn't control me. How dare you impose your worldview on me, and jump off? Well, what's going to happen? Gravity is going to take its effect. And moral law acts in the very same way because it is part of the laws of nature and of nature's God. So in any society across world history, human beings have always had to contend with truth and determine, are we going to have a society that recognizes discoverable truth, or are we going to try to come up with a moral code for ourselves? And look how well that worked out for Nazi Germany. Look how well that has worked out for many past government institutions, the Middle Ages and the kings who wanted all powers vested in themselves. And there was no separation between the church government and its system versus the state and its system, where we see that clearly separated in Scripture, where pastors and the ecclesia and the order of the elders and the people who were ordained to be in church authority could determine for the church how to exercise church discipline, what is good and profitable as doctrine, how to understand when and where and how the church operates. That is very separate than what we see in Romans 13 of the civil government that carries the sword. It's very different than what we see in Scripture for the family government, where we have parents that institute justice in their own home. But aren't we very glad that parents don't carry the sword? None of us would probably be here because we've all been that kid at one point or another, right? So God ordained and established 3 spheres of government that exercise different jurisdictions and different authority structures, but they are all under Him. They are all under nature's God and the laws of nature. They just have different realms and different jurisdiction, different authority. So when we're looking for the truth in the family structure, that is why the civil society must recognize that marriage is between one man and one woman, that children are only, by the laws of nature, the product of one man and one woman. You can't get around that. There is no union of 2 men or 3 men or 4 women and a lamppost, as apparently that constitutes a union these days, that will have a product of a child and produce offspring. That is part of the laws of nature and of nature's God. And so our founders simply recognized at their time in establishing this great country that the laws of nature are discoverable. They are self-evident. And when we declared as a country our independence from another type of government system, the founders specifically appealed to the supreme judge of the universe for the rectitude of their intentions. That word rectitude means a moral uprightness, meaning self-evident good, right, truth. And in rebelling, it was not a rebellion that was a fight or an attitude of hostility or of arrogance or of sinfulness. It was a proper rebellion in the sense that we are never obligated to follow unjust or moral unrighteousness. We are called, as human beings made in God's image, to always follow the person of God and the truth, even when our authorities tell us to go against the laws of nature and of nature's God. Our founders recognized that their rights that could not be alienated from them were being so abused and infringed, they appealed to the divine lawgiver himself and said, because of all of these injustices, when in the course of human events, right, is our great declaration that unanimously was declared and put into the world for the rectitude publicly of their intentions. And they said, we have had so many abuses and infringements upon our rights that it becomes necessary to dissolve the political bands which hold us together. They recognized the truth that God gives us our rights, not any government. So we can disband our political connections in order to have a moral and upright society. That declaration was the mandate recognizing God's sovereignty over the universe and over civil society, as well as the church and the family, and over the reality to which we are presented. And then the founders had to debate together and say, okay, we have now said we're going to start and establish and ordain this country toward a more perfect union. How do we do that? They did not say, well, we know best, and we will all get together and decide how to arbitrate our new reality or redefine what it means to be a moral and upright system. No, they simply debated how best do we carry out that mandate. They did not hold themselves up as the sum of all wisdom or as the lawgivers themselves. That's why in our U.S. Constitution, we can amend it. We can change our governors through an election process. We, the people, get to select and prefer our leaders. No one in this country is entitled to hold political power through either heritage or conquest or any other means. We, the people, get to decide who is in power and holds that political power for the term that we elect them to. And our founders recognized that they were flawed. And they said, so here is our best effort. And it was a fantastic effort. It is the greatest document governing a civil society, I think, in the history of civil governments, because they recognized that the truth of the Judeo-Christian God is where we get our rights. That's the only reason that the Constitution is so brilliant. And they allowed for amending the Constitution through the separation of powers, and one of those powers is to amend how our system works. So my dad is literally a rocket scientist, right? So he works on satellites, and he has strategic missions at his place of work. And when they're designing systems and operational systems and all of the different modules and things that go along with these satellites, they have an objective. They set the course and they design the satellite to achieve that objective. And now, are there course corrections and modifications as this is being built, as it's continuing after the launch, as it's already on course for its mission? Well, yes. And so when we call this a system of government, it's like any other system in the sense that we designed it for a specific purpose. Just like God designed our bodies for a specific purpose. We have an internal system, and he designed the universe that way. Well, when we design a system of government, the objective in America is to preserve and protect the rights that God gives us. And so we can make course corrections, and we have. We've amended our Constitution 27 times in our nation's history. And some of those modifications have been good. The first 10 amendments, what we know is the Bill of Rights, specifically enumerated protections for the rights that governments most often infringe upon. Those are good things. But then we've done some other things that I personally think are not so great, like the 16th Amendment, to give the federal government the ability to lay and collect income tax. I think we could all agree, not fun, not great, and that has overexpanded the federal government. We also have the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the popular election of U.S. senators, so that now we have a system that is offset, that the federal government has no tie to the state legislature, and the states have no voice in Washington because the members of the Senate are not beholden to their state legislators anymore. That was a design on purpose, and I think we tampered with the system in a way that has yielded really bad results for the country. Now, we have the 19th Amendment, which as a woman, and I can definitely say I can define what a woman is, I am one. The 19th Amendment allowed me the privilege of voting for my elected officials. I think that's a good thing, right? So we've had these conversations nationally, not over the definition of what our rights are, but how do we best preserve and protect them, and how do we make adjustments to our system to better achieve that strategic objective? But now, in this day and age in our culture, we are having a conversation about rights. We are having a conversation of whether or not we are a Christian nation. Well, why is that? Because we've lost sight of the strategic objective. And the left would like to use that system against us. They would like to go in hostily and to try to pervert that system to achieve a very, very different goal. And this is why we're seeing Supreme Court cases, for example, like the Bostock decision that read into the 1964 Civil Rights Act that was meant by that Congress to protect the biological difference between men and women, that we cannot, as a society, discriminate on the basis of sex. That meant the difference between men and women. You can't discriminate against someone just because they are biologically, scientifically, a man or a woman. But this decision, which was the majority of even conservative, or what we would consider conservative justices, read into that and said, well, no, now in 2021, we're going to say that sex includes sexual orientation and gender identity. As if 1964 Congress would have possibly considered that. So not only are they manipulating the laws of nature and of nature's God to weaponize a term sex, but they're also reading into the minds of their prior colleagues in the legislature. And so we're having this conversation of what is protected as a civil right. How do we determine what are human rights? And the flaw that most of us debating these questions present is that we accept the debate on their terms. We accept that we get to define what a civil right is, rather than saying as a threshold question and a basic assumption. We need to have as a basic assumption that God himself defines us, that the empirical revelation of self-evident truth has to be part of that conversation as a threshold proposition. That men are men, women are women, that we cannot control or arbitrate our own reality. So the question then of what is a civil right becomes a much simpler question to ask and answer when we say, all we have to do is understand who the person of God is, what is the self-evident truth, and then the answer becomes simple. And we can look to the self-evident truth that God gives us in his general revelation, which is the world around us, empirically, biology, understanding that we've always known. We can even look back at mummies that are thousands of years old and determine their sex, right? Without asking them. That is general revelation. It's self-evident truth. And then we have the specific revelation, the Word of God in the Bible, that tells us who he is specifically. We can know him. We can know the person of truth. It is self-evident. And so as our founders understood that the laws of nature and of nature's God are binding on our reality, our system of government was fashioned recognizing as a basic assumption and proposition and foundation that the person of truth is real and that reality cannot be manipulated by man. But we have now all of these God substitutes called the Supreme Court, called Congress, called governors, all of these different deliberative bodies that want to impose their will and definitions and manipulations of reality, and that is unconstitutional. Well, why? Because our Constitution as a system was designed with a basic assumption that the laws of nature and of nature's God are true. So if the left would like to redefine reality, they first have to get rid of our system of government. And interestingly, that's exactly what they're trying to do. Because they understand that our system was so beautifully designed that we have a lot of fail-safes. If something goes wrong, we have a lot of fire extinguishers. They separated powers. They limited powers. So government cannot simply impose its will and infringe that will upon you. The government cannot simply ask and answer the question, what is a workable standard to kill human beings in the womb? That's just not a right that the Constitution protects. The Constitution doesn't even actually articulate in its original articles any rights. Why is that? Well, because God's already defined them And all that the Constitution had to do was tell the government what limited powers it has in order to protect our rights. So when the US Supreme Court, in all of their ridiculous wisdom, got together in 1965 in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut, they were facing for the first time in the midst of the sexual revolution how to deal with a contraceptive case and whether or not the state of Connecticut could regulate a woman's access to contraceptives. Now, the US Constitution does not give the Supreme Court any power to arbitrate that. Well, why? Because if you look at Article 1, Section 1, all legislative authority is given to Congress. Article 1, Section 8 says, hey, Congress, here are the about 18 different subject matter that you, the federal government, can legislate on. What are things that are not given to Congress as subject matters? Education, healthcare, a lot of different things. If it is not listed in Article 1, Section 8 as a subject matter, like, for example, the Uniform Rule of Immigration and Naturalization, our founders said that probably affects the whole country, so we don't want to have states having different rules of immigration. We'll give that to the federal government. But very, very limited specific things. And the US Supreme Court should only arbitrate federal questions. So things like abortion regulation and access to contraceptives and the definition of marriage, anything dealing with domestic relations, is not given to the federal government at all. So the Supreme Court shouldn't be arbitrating anything on it. But that Supreme Court in 1965 wanted to. It was an activist court, and so said, we are literally going to read between the lines of the Constitution and find rights that emanate from the vast penumbra of the Constitution. This is known by lawyers as the penumbra doctrine, where they literally said it's not in the text, but we're going to find some rights that the Constitution grants in the lines between the text, the space between. They fabricated it out of nowhere. And every single social justice opinion that has come out from the Supreme Court since 1965 that included not only Griswold, but Roe versus Wade, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, Lawrence versus Texas, that allowed for homosexual relations, eventually leading to Obergefell versus Hodges, which redefined marriage for the states, overriding about 31 state constitutional amendments to their own state constitutions. Every single one of those cases came from the penumbra doctrine. And that's because a group of humans got together and said, we are going to arbitrate our own reality. We are going to reject the laws of nature and of nature's God. And we are going to override the system. Well, thankfully, the Dobbs case was a way that we corrected course and corrected Roe versus Wade. We still have a lot of correcting to do over the last about 60 years plus of jurisprudence. And that's just the Supreme Court. I'm not even talking about all of the other problems with overreaching executive orders and the executive agencies that are wholly unconstitutional. And why do we use that term unconstitutional? No power is given to that federal agency or that state governor to implement the proposal and the policy that they suggest and want to ordain and establish. We are a nation that limits power. So when we say it is unconstitutional, we are jumping ahead if we're even entertaining the conversation of whether or not it's good policy, whether or not transgenders should have civil rights in this country. I would love to know where they think they even can. That's the question. We have a question of whether or not the government can first. Then we get to the question of should. Should is the question of policy, but that is fully contingent on a government that can. And in so many instances, in probably 95% or more of what government actors across all levels in this country want to do, they can't. And that is wholly unconstitutional. And it is un-American. And it is also, I would submit, un-Christian, because we are a nation that recognizes the laws of nature and the person of nature's God. So we have to remember, and this is a chart that I put in my book along with a hierarchy and a pyramid showing that divine law is the foundation. The laws of nature and of nature's God is the foundation that the Declaration of Independence was then built on. Then we have the U.S. Constitution on top of that, and in the intermediary, we also have the Federalist Papers that simply said, this is how we designed our system. This is why we advocated for it. And so we have to go back when we are asked the question, are we a Christian nation? Say, absolutely yes. And the answer to that does not depend on whether you acknowledge the laws of nature or the person of nature's God, because reality will be imposed upon you whether you believe in it or not. The law of gravity and a lot of different natural laws will be imposed upon you whether or not you like it. Your sex is determined for you whether or not you like it. The definition of marriage and how children come about into this world is defined for you. We can't change that. The church, and that Christ is the head of the church, is defined by him. We cannot change that. So we have to go back and say, yes, we are a Christian nation. That does not depend on whether you are a Christian. You are reaping the blessings of liberty because we are a nation that recognizes truth and reality. But we cannot allow the secular humanist playing field to arbitrate our debates any longer. We have to say we are not a social contract theory country. We are not given to the arbitrary whim of what deliberative bodies or even the mob of voters, and to say, well, the popular vote should be what controls whatever the people want. So many people will point to polls and say, well, 56% of Americans want this. Well, 56% of Americans may want to repeal the law of gravity. That's not going to happen. I don't care whether 1% or 100% of people agree with truth. Truth is self-evident and exists in and of itself. God exists whether or not people acknowledge him. So we cannot allow our system to be manipulated any longer. We cannot have a social contract theory debate. We have to come back to the laws of nature and of nature's God and say our rights are acknowledged, are declared and discovered as unalienable. They are part of our intrinsic humanity, and that's not up for debate. So this chart talks about the differences in the law between divine law and a social contract theory. So the origin of the law under a divine law system says that God himself, the person of truth. Social contract theory would say man, the God substitute. The rationale for any law under divine law has to be fixed and objective, where a social contract theory would say it's fluid, it's subjective to whatever man in this current culture and era decides, whatever's workable. The authority under divine law is God's sovereignty. Under social contract, it's simply man's agreement. And this is why we are seeing the attempt to rule by force. Because if we won't agree as Christians to be compelled to speak things that violate our sincerely held religious beliefs, our conscience, and truth, and we don't agree, they're going to just force us. Because freedom of speech in this country is not just the freedom to speak that with which I do believe, but the freedom to refrain from being compelled to speak the things that I disagree with. Right. Falsity. And enforcement under divine law is moral law, the laws of nature, and God's supremacy that we see clearly in both general and specific revelation. We see his sovereignty everywhere. The psalmist says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. We see God's supremacy everywhere. The social contract theory would say it's only codified law. It's whatever our law permits or prohibits, and it's man's power of force. And force is the tyranny that we have seen other systems that are built based on this social contract and man's arbitrary whim, whether it is a mob or whether it is one king that is a tyrant. We have to go back to fixed, objective, moral law. So our interpretation of laws, when we come down to the essential question, are we a Christian nation? Do we have to abide by the laws of nature? Well, any interpretation of the U.S. Constitution must be consistent with biblical truth, with the laws of nature and of nature's God. A social contract theory would say that the interpretation of laws will change to the whims of a dominant society, and that the Constitution is just this nice little piece of parchment that's simply a parchment guarantee. And it is fluid, and we can read into it, read between the lines of the text, and why even have it at all if we can read magically between the space, or in the space between the lines? That is a whole social contract theory, secular humanist God substitute model. And so in closing, I would encourage all of us as Christians to understand our system of government. Because if we allow our adversaries to understand the complexity and beauty of the system more than we do, then they will understand how to manipulate it better than we understand how to use it and protect it. Our Constitution is a beautiful system, and I am so proud to be an American because we live in the greatest country across world history. Why? Not just because we're proud to be patriots, but because our founders recognized the truth that our rights come from God, our Creator, and not our government. We have to continue to enforce and emphatically defend that, yes, we are a Christian nation. Thank you.